Hello all, welcome to this session. In this session, I'm going to answer one of the Java interview questions. That is, what is the difference between checked and unchecked exceptions in Java? Let me answer. In Java, the exceptions can be categorized at a high level into two types. One is checked exceptions and other one are unchecked exceptions. Coming to the checked exceptions, these are the exceptions which are checked by the compiler during the compile time. Before you run the program itself, when you write the code in any of the editors that are supporting the Java programming, right? In that editor, the Java compiler will compile the code before you run the Java programs, and the compiler will identify the possibility of the exceptions at some particular lines. Such kind of exceptions which are identified by the compiler, Java compiler, before you run the programs, that there is a possibility of an exception at this particular so and so point. Such type of exceptions are known as checked exceptions. Then what are unchecked exceptions? The unchecked exceptions are the exceptions that you can encounter only after running the code, that is during the runtime. During the compile time, while your code is there, okay, while you are writing the code, before you run the code, you will not get to know that there is a possibility of exception here. Compiler is not going to identify that at this particular line there is a possibility of exception. Rather, when you run the code in the output, while the program is running during the runtime, in the output directly you will get the exception, guys. Okay, such kind of exceptions which are not detected by the compiler or not identified by the compiler during the compile time before running the code are known as unchecked exceptions. Okay, the ones that are identified by the compiler before you run the code are called as checked exceptions. Okay, and coming to the unchecked exceptions, they are not identified by the compiler or not detected by the compiler before you run the code. Okay, fine. Here compiler won't notify us about the possibility of the exception at so and so line. Only will come to know about this particular unchecked exceptions during the runtime, okay, in the output console when error is coming. Okay, and coming to the checked exceptions, compiler will detect them before you run the code itself. During the compile time only, the compiler will identify that there is a possibility of so and so exception at this particular line. Let me practically demonstrate, guys, so that it will be easy to understand for you. For that, I'll expand this project, guys. I'll expand this project. Here in exception handling mechanism, I'll just create a package, guys. I'll just name this package as 1.1 some sub package. I'll just move this earlier demonstrated files under this package. Say okay. Along with that, once that is done, it's still going on. Once that is done, I'll create one more package here. I'll just name this package as 2 guys dot 2 package 2. Press enter, and under the package, guys, under this package, I'm going to create a new class. I'll just name this class as checked and unchecked exceptions demo. Like this, I'll create some name, guys. Okay, and or else I'll just say unchecked exceptions demo. Okay, these are the whatever the example I'm going to give you are the examples of the unchecked exceptions that compiler will not detect during the compile time. After you run the code only, in the output console you'll get such kind of exceptions. Okay, here I'll write something like this: int a is equal to 5, comma b is equal to 0, comma c. Here c is equal to a divided by b, and here I'll write down system.out.println c. So guys, are you getting any compiler error, or is the compiler coming and suggesting that there is a possibility of an exception here if you run the code? No, I don't see any compiler error, or compiler is not detecting that there is a possibility of exception at so and so line in this program. But when I run the code, after I run the code, guys, in the runtime, okay, while the code is getting executed in the output console, you will get this exception, okay, arithmetic exception. Hence, arithmetic exception is a checked exception or unchecked exception. It's a perfect example of unchecked exception, guys, because compiler has not detected the possibility of the exception during the compile time. That's why it's called as unchecked exception. The only possibility of finding this exception is after running the code in the output console. If you get this kind of runtime error like arithmetic exception, okay, then we have to consider this particular arithmetic exception as a one of the example of the unchecked exception, which is not identified or checked by the compiler during compile time. Only possibility is to find during the runtime after running the code. Similarly, we have other unchecked exceptions like, input mismatch exception, array index out of bounds exception. I am not going to demonstrate each and every example for you. I just gave one example. That is example here I demonstrated is array index. Sorry, arithmetic exception is a simple example I gave here where the compiler was not checking or identifying. Compiler has not checked or identified the possibility of exception here. Okay, it's an arithmetic exception. And coming to the unchecked exception, coming to the arithmetic exception, guys, coming to the unchecked exception. So this is the unchecked exception, guys. Sorry, I just wrote it a different place. And coming to the checked exception, first I covered the unchecked exception, where the compiler will not identify or detect the possibility of the exception. Only in the runtime will come to know. Okay, one of the example is arithmetic exception. And coming to the checked exception, the compiler will detect here, guys. Okay, before we run the code only, the compiler will suggest that there is a possibility of particular exception in so and so line. For that, I'm going to write the code. I'll take one example of that. Right click here, new class. I'll just name this as checked exception demo. With main method I'll create. Here, guys, very simple example I'll give you. That is thread.sleep. In Java, we have thread, multi-threading concept, right? If you want to halt this particular thread for just 5 seconds, you just have to give 5,000 milliseconds. If you hover the mouse on this particular simple line, right, unhandled exception type, interrupted exception. So what the compiler is saying that whether we get the exception during runtime or not, but here the compiler is detecting that there is a possibility of an exception and is asking us to handle this exception in advance. Was this kind of compiler error are we getting with the unchecked exceptions like arithmetic exception? No. This is an example of a checked exception where this particular line, when I write, the Java compiler is suggesting that there is a possibility of an interrupted exception here. So interrupted exception will come under which category? Checked exception category, because it is being identified or detected by the compiler, okay, before we run the program itself. So since compiler is already suggesting, there are two possibilities, guys. Either you can ignore the exception by adding, like this, by ignoring the exception, that is one thing. Or you can also surround with this try catch block. You can also surround this with try catch block also, guys. Any of these possibilities are fine, okay? You can also surround with try catch block in advance. That is the only way to handle the exception. I'll just go back here. Anyhow, the compiler is suggesting that there's a possibility of exception here and is asking us to either handle it or shut the mouth of the compiler. Okay. So at least the compiler is suggesting that there's a possibility of an exception at this line. Okay. That's why this kind of interrupted exception is one of the example for checked exception, which is checked by the compiler, identified or checked by the compiler. Interrupted exception is one of the example of the checked exception. So with practical demonstration, I've explained you theoretical explanation and practical demonstration I covered. I explained this answer for this particular question, guys. So hope, guys, you got the answer for this question. So that's all for this session. Thank you. Bye-bye.